Welcome to episode 112. Thank you for joining us. This week, I sit down with Colonel Eric Ferris Buer, former Cobra pilot and author of the book Ghosts of Baghdad Marine Corps Gunships on the Opening Days of the Iraq War. As the title suggests, his book looks at the war in Iraq from 2003 to 2004 from the perspective of a Cobra pilot supporting troops on the ground. I really found his perspective interesting because most of the narratives coming out of the Long War have either been from the ground or from fixed wing aviators. I'm embarrassed to admit that his point of view from the cockpit was a perspective from our operations during the Long War that I hadn't considered, especially considering that in many ways I owe my current existence to the actions of rotary wing close air support. Being that he and his rotary wing brethren are so inextricably linked to ground maneuver and thus exposed to a threat level, and quite frankly, a grit level, that many of the fixed wing community are not, his experiences and views on the war are fascinating. Here is episode 112. Enjoy. Hey, Scuttlebutt listeners, welcome back. Thank you, as always, for joining us. I am Vic, and today I am really excited to be welcoming Colonel Eric Ferris Buer to the show. Uh, Colonel Buer is a Cobra pilot, and we don't have a lot of pilots on the show. And he is the author of the book Ghosts of Baghdad, a really fantastic memoir looking back on his time as a gunship pilot during the invasion OIF-1. And it's a perspective that we don't have enough on this show. As ground pounders, we love to talk about swinging with the wing. But, today I'm all about the swing because his perspectives from the air, so interesting having been on the ground during the invasion. I was so sort of myopically focused on what was going on. I really hadn't considered all of the things that the pilots who were, essentially keeping us alive many of the times, what they were going through, what their experiences were. So the Ghosts of Baghdad was really a great exploration of that. So, anyways, with all that, sir, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks, Vic. It's great to be here. It's great to be with your listeners this morning.
And sir, so if you wouldn't mind, be as brief or as long-winded as you want, but really would like to hear your story on what your path to the Yellow Footprints was, where you're from, what your thoughts were, as a young man about the Marine Corps, and then what eventually, brought you into the cockpit.
I think my story is no different than, you know, the tens of thousands of us in our kind of, year groups that made the same decisions and choices. At the time I was originally from San Francisco and I was going to college in Ohio. And I was already thinking about what's the next step in my life. Where am I going to be? What am I going to do? And so many of the folks I was surrounded by, they're going to be New York City stockbrokers and all these things. And I just knew that was not going to be for me. And by hook or by crook, I found my way into a recruiting office in Columbus, Ohio, and I walked into one of those silver tongued devils, called a recruiter, and you know, it's and he sat me down and we talked, and he just gave me his pitch, and I said, well, this sounds pretty inviting. And so, I came back a couple days later, as we all do. I threw on some PT gear, did some pull-ups, push-ups, or sit-ups, or whatever we did back in the day, and went for a run. And that early next summer, I was in Quantico, Virginia, wondering what I signed up for.
Yeah, like I thought it was just gonna PT.
Yeah, right. There's no condos. This is
Yeah.
so. So that's really that's how it really began for me. And then, the deeper you get into an organization, I've always liked to think I've kept a pretty positive outlook on things. As a deeper I got in, he talked about aviation, and here's a chance you can go fly, and I just took every opportunity they gave me. I took, and, it's your typical C plus student forced to do, B work. and you grind through it. And I was, fortunate enough to go to flight training and fortunate enough to get through flight training. Uh, and then I worked my way into the cockpit of a Cobra, which was, really a dream come true. So that
Yeah,
was my yeah.
grunts of the air, right? So isn't that what they say about Cobra pilots?
Yeah, it's there's really no one closer in my mind. There's no one really kind of understands, we live and breathe with commander's intent. We live and breathe with your scheme of maneuver, and we try to get as much information as we possibly can. And as you'll soon find out, we have a deep appreciation, and it's really it's more than that. It's really this connection between us and our Marines fighting on the ground that we felt a massive obligation to.
If you mind just backing up a little bit, sir. So San Fran, Ohio, that seems like I mean, of all of the culture shifts that Marines go through, that one seemed pretty drastic at a young age. Were you an athlete?
So I was a very, very subpar athlete. Thank you for bringing that up, Vic. I appreciate that.
It's
Um,
what we do here. So we pick at scabs.
no, I was a lacrosse player. I grew up. I'd actually gone to school in New Hampshire, um, and so I picked up. I'd played my whole life. Hockey. I was a hockey player, I was a lacrosse player, and then I decided to go to college and play lacrosse. And so that was what initially brought me to Ohio. And so that's a good point. That's a I went from one coast to the other to kind of in the middle. Uh, but school was a great fit for me. It was a great opportunity for me to meet lifelong friends. Compete in sports for 4 years, which keeps you disciplined, which keeps you focused, which keeps you fit, which is great. Um, and then I didn't believe I was going to have a career in Ohio or anywhere else. I just once I had an opportunity to talk to that recruiter, I think the die had been cast, for kind of a lack of better terms.
Yeah, that seems like a pretty common refrain from college athletes that there's this sense of like a real appreciation for getting that 4 more years of, like you said, so that discipline, that schedule, that camaraderie that comes with most extracurricular sports, varsity level stuff, and then there's almost a reading of the tea leaves where you're like, this is going away, and I don't want it to. And I think a lot of, I don't know, does that resonate with you, sir?
It does. There is a great sense of fraternity or sorority. There's that great sense of which I talked to Marines about a lot. There's that sense of family and teamwork that you don't really get anywhere else. Um, and so that really it was different, but it was familiar in so many ways to me, particularly as time went on in the Marine Corps.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'm just guessing then, as a lax guy, um, did you ever, in those moments where did you ever look up at the sky and go, "Yeah, I'm gonna be up there," or was it like you kind of articulated more along the lines of, as these opportunities are presenting themselves, I'm just gonna jump on it.
Well, as a kid, I always had a fascination with aviation, and so that was one of the draws. Again, back to a recruiter, we talk about, hey, there's this incredible challenge and kind of responsibility of being a Marine, and in particular being a Marine officer, and then an opportunity to fly and do both. And again, that was really the glue that sealed the deal, was that, hey, you can do both. And I didn't even really know at the time what type of aircraft we had. On a cursory look, I kind of knew what the Marine Corps flew, but it really didn't matter. I knew I had this kind of love of aviation. I didn't exactly know why. Um, but again, the two coming together seemed like something that would work for me.
And then, so you went to OCS. Were you a PLC, OCC, junior, seniors?
Peel, so my first step out of that bus was in lovely Camp Upshur, which literally seemed like you stepped back into the 1950s.
It
Um,
sure
it was
right there to the
something
train tracks.
It was unbelievable. That's when I was saying I don't know, there was 20 Quonset huts and some some very cantankerous men yelling at me, to do things that I wasn't sure what they wanted me to do or how to do. Uh, but interestingly enough, couple of those senior drill instructors, they became gunners, and they became, kind of mentors to me who I deployed with over the years. But yeah, it started out, I was a PLC guy and went out to Camp Upshur, and you're right, it was a great opportunity to just forget the rest of the world and focus on what, of course, they wanted me to focus on for those weeks. Um, yeah, then
Yeah,
making
the
the decision.
most important thing was like what flag is going up in the morning, right? Like,
Oh yeah, yeah. Although I just remember the runs through those trails, and it was. I mean, I look back. Of course, we always look back a little bit different, but I enjoyed it. I certainly enjoyed PLC juniors, and for the most part, when I went back the next summer, um, I went back the next summer. This time, of course, on Main Side in Quantico, and got to run a new set of trails.
yeah.
So that part's great.
So when did you take the flight test? Was it after juniors, when back at your OSO's office, or were you already commissioned?
So I went through the flight. I had a a contract. I think I did that, the first couple times in my OSO's office. So I had a flight
Okay.
contract going to the basic school. I had a flight contract. I guess in theory, I had a flight contract going to OCS, but I didn't really recall it as a thing. But I knew I was listed as a flight contract when I finally got to the basic school.
Okay. Very cool. Uh, um, so then, yeah, so one of the interesting things that we've been exploring, obviously, talent management, uh, 2030 is, real paradigm shift. Um, and I thought it was a very bold maneuver for Marine Corps leadership to acknowledge not just the great power competition when we're looking at geopolitical, but within domestically, in our competition with industry, um, and there's uh, so many things that are changing that seem pretty obvious, common sense approaches. But I think in our new efforts to retain talent, um, we're we're looking at some things that, again, I think seem fairly obvious, but they're going to be new, and it's going to be a culture change. And I think one of them that's been explored here at the Gazette has been this idea of what do you do with pilots who are just in a holding pattern, awaiting training. Did you run into that as you were leaving TBS? What was your experiences like going from Quantico to Pensacola?
Interesting. So I took a break, and I was on the U.S. pentathlon, the military pentathlon team for probably 6 8 months, 6 months anyway. So I'd left there. I tried out. I made the Marine team, and then I went to Texas, and we made the U.S. team, a couple of us, and then we traveled through Europe and competed. So when I finally got back to the basic school, my class was all gone, and so I got orders right down there, and I checked into Pensacola, and they put me but right into training, which was nice. There's always pools, the pig and the snake is difficult. I had to manage that process. I didn't have to manage it. I was responsible for portions of that process when I was in Pensacola on my last tour. Uh, but yeah, it's always a challenge. It's always a challenge with demand, and it's always hard to predict the number of Marines who are going to leave, aviators in particular, who are going to leave the service after their first tours. What incentivizes them to stay in. The Marine Corps has compressed some platforms and compressed some mission sets, and that drives to an excess of aviators, and that drives the demand down. And the flash to bang is always slow. It's a very imperfect process.
Yeah.
So I empathize with it. Um, but yeah, it's nothing new. It's nothing new. I tell you a quick story. I was in Quantico as a captain going through the amphibious warfare school, and I was writing a paper, and I found I was in the aviation section, of course, and I found this little pamphlet, and I was reading it. This was 1996 probably. I was in amphibious warfare school, And the pamphlet was about the loss of aviators, and the Marine Corps had been giving bonuses to them, and then the aviation world and commercial world was in such high demand that the Marine Corps continued to hemorrhage pilots, and there's a cycle of losing pilots and having to recruit more and stoppages. And I flipped the primer over, and it was written in 1954. So
Get out of here.
I was like, wow. And we've seen that cycle through the early 90s, certainly through post 9/11. We've seen it most recently. So it's a cycle that goes through, and I know there's folks that get their advanced degrees in manpower and analytics, and I think it's a very difficult manpower issue. It's because there's so many variables involved in it. But I don't think the Marine Corps is going any way from manned aircraft in our lifetime. They may be a portion of it, but I don't know that it's going to be the case.
Well, yeah, I think your book, and granted, most of the event, well, I guess all of the events in this book take place, almost, over 2 decades ago, or I guess almost exactly 2 decades ago. But the stuff that you highlight in here, I think, really reinforces that idea that um, unmanned aircraft, unmanned vehicles are definitely a force multiplier, but they can't be the core of our arsenal for many of the things um, that you sort of highlight here in Ghosts of Baghdad. But before we do get in your book, which I definitely want to jump into, so I don't want to take too much of your time here, sir. But um, you talk about walking into the recruiter's office. Was there any idea, like, as you were going through the sort of initial phases of, taking the flight exam and things, of like maybe looking at the Navy, the Air Force as a potential option for flying, or were you always going to just stay green?
I didn't really look at the other services. As the Marine Corps, I was just drawn in there, just the way it worked. I was drawn into that office, and I haven't talked to the OSO, by the way, who was a Cobra pilot. Who,
No, no
you know,
kidding.
yeah,
Funny.
Cobra pilot, and he gave a very compelling story. That was it. I didn't leave there. I didn't ever feel a need to go anywhere else. So no, I never considered going anywhere else.
Nice. Well, appreciate your loyalty, sir.
Oh, brand loyalty early on. I know. I hear you.
Yeah, yeah. So this book, Ghosts of Baghdad, really fantastic, sort of again, a perspective of the invasion that I hadn't really, embarrassingly so, I hadn't really even considered. It was just so focused on sort of what was going on to the left and right of me. Um, but this is a fairly recent book. I mean, it came out this year, correct?
It did.
And so what made you 20 years? Is it because it's been 20 years, or what was sort of the impetus behind this book being produced?
Yeah. It had been in the back of my head for a while. Um, the problem with 2003, it led to going back in 2004 and going to back in 2005. So
Right.
didn't really have deployments after that. So it wasn't like we had a lot of time to really to think about it. Um, but I'd thought about it, and as time going by, um, I knew the story needed to be told. I mean, we're a terribly proud and humble service, and we always are. We always have been, and we're always hesitant to tell our stories, and particularly about the people we serve with. And I thought about it, and I talked to some close friends who were there with me, and I interviewed them, and I asked them questions, and I shared some stories, and I was blown away about the reaction. So, in one way, very selfishly, I was given hundreds of hours with old friends to rehash kind of old memories, and I didn't want it to be 50 years. I didn't need it to be, Band of Brothers. I would never compare this to Band of Brothers. That's clearly an iconic book, and the story is incredible. Um, but I needed to tell their stories, and I also felt that it needed to be told by someone who was there. Who could talk to them, and we could together we could remember the smells, we could remember the sounds, we could remember the voices. You can get it. You can taste that sand, right? There's like that humidity and that dankness. And you talk to people and you listen to them tell their stories and you understand that. And so I had an opportunity to reconnect with my co-pilot, my wingman, his co-pilot, my COs, XOs, air group commanders, crew chiefs, dozens of others on the air and in the ground, right? So it was great talking to infantry friends of mine and get their perspectives. And so, after I had that, it really, the book, within reason, it wrote itself, and that made it easy, and that made it fun, and it made it very satisfying.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many instances where I think back and like, oh, I was there, or I remember when that happened. One of the things that you take a really deep dive into, and that I really appreciated, was your experiences in Nasiriyah. For me, I remember seeing that army convoy just go zooming past us in the cordon, and like, who the fuck are like? First, my first thought is, are we going in? And then it was like, who the fuck are those guys? And then we stayed out in the cordon, and then we just kept going. After Task Force Terror went in and all of that stuff, we moved on. But you were there operating for days. What was it about Nazaria that you felt compelled to dedicate so much of the book to?
It was, I was flying out of New River, so I'm an East Coast guy. I've been an East Coast guy uh, for the vast majority of my career, and so I had Task Force Tara was led by General Latansky, who I'd gone to Somalia with 10 years earlier, and I'd known him, and we'd stayed in touch over the years. And in the battalions, at First Battalion, Second Marines, I had friends that were at this time XOs and OPSOs, and I lived in Jacksonville. I knew some of the company commanders, and that were neighbors of mine, and so you had this attachment to them, whether you wanted to really accept it or not. And then, and by the time we got into the city, it was late on when we really had the real issues in Nasiriyah early on in March. Um, you could see the destruction and the devastation, and so it was for us. It was our first time really doing a significant amount of close air support. I mean, very close air support, and so everything was very new to us, and we cut our teeth a lot of ways. And as a leader, I made more mistakes than I ever made good decisions. And then you just find a way to recover. And I had great, I got a young captain, and two captains as my wingman, and I was a pretty senior major at the time. Um, had been selected for lieutenant colonel, but in the Marine Corps we call those majors. Thank goodness. So Nazarene, played a big role for us, and the 507's going through there. It would play a role later on, as friends of mine had gone back into the city in early April to rescue and recover those soldiers, and so it played a big role for all of us. And
Mhm.
it was important for our squadron. It was important for me, and as I listened to my pilots and folks I flew with, it was really important for them. So again, it was critical that I captured as much of that as I could.
Yeah, we've had Sergeant Major Justin LaHue on the show a couple times, friend of the show, and it would be great, honestly, to get both of you guys in the same room to talk about that. Because that's where he got his Silver Star. But going back, so you mentioned no, still his Navy Cross. I'm so sorry, his Navy Cross. So you had mentioned Somalia, and the title of the book, Ghosts of Baghdad. The ghost is a reoccurring character, and it makes its first appearance for you in Somalia. And it really made me wonder about sort of the nature of the ghost, the origin of the ghost. Can you talk a little bit about the ghost and like what it was about Somalia, where sort of almost intuitively that's who you're now, flying with, and then sort of the ghost sort of resurgence then in 2003.
So, in all honesty, I've been a bottom third TBS, AWS, command and staff war college grad. If I'm not, I should have been. But I did, pick up a few things along the way, that stuck with me. Thank goodness to great instructors and great professors. But kidding aside, for me, I as I was, I took pretty detailed notes on this deployment, all my deployments, and now you can take the fog and the friction, the uncertainty and the chance. In aviation, you had machines, right? You had very complex machines. You had weather. You had moonless nights and endless deserts for me, and it all manifests itself into something, for me that I could and that I needed to visualize or at least conceptualize. So to believe there's a ghost out there, it helped me focus. There's always a ghost out there, and it would always, you know, then in this case, I or we, who I'm flying with, could always be preparing for the kind of the unknown, right? The unimagined, the unpredicted. And so it was, I didn't really know at the time, but there was always something in the back of my head gnawing at me. There was something that always caused me to look right or left. I don't know what it was, seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th sense. Um, but it wasn't until I sat down and began writing the book that I really realized, kind of what it was, and who and what the ghost really is. I'll let the readers make their own conclusion. And I don't want to spoil anything. There's no great unveil, but the ghost really becomes everything that I think all of us who served in combat, whether it's once, twice, three or four times, it's something in the back of our mind. We know there's something out there, and maybe it's a combination of all that with the enemy, with an agile thinking enemy. Um, but it's something that it always keeps us alert and awake. And so I really how I saw that's really how I saw the ghost, and it certainly morphs over time. And in my mind, it became something much more real than that. And as you read and you see, and as the ghost, kind of appears, it just leaves nothing but kind of death and destruction in the path. So that was really my driver, and it was probably my better way of explaining things. I don't know if I always effectively do that, but I certainly hope I did, and I hope I do. So that's
What
really,
definitely came off to me is something more like visceral or personal than like the fog of war. Like it's so sterile when we talk about the fog of war because it's just a principle of warfare, a character of warfare, um, and it's a planning factor. Fog of war. But I think that when you sort of personify it and anthropomorphize it as this ghost, I think it really does sort of bring home what you're talking about, sir, is that it's not just uncertainty. There is a physical manifestation of it, and it always sucks. It's always shitty. Yeah, it's usually death and destruction in its wake.
you're absolutely right. And as I looked at weather, you lived it, right? You remember orange mud flying sideways at you, right? You remember the
That's
sandstorm.
that's it was biblical. That was fucking ridiculous.
Right? Like, how does sand get in the bottom of my M9 magazine? Right?
Yeah.
How does it possibly get in there? But
No, I remember thinking like when it first was happening, like we're so screwed. Like this is the world that that the Iraqis operate in. They're gonna kill us all, and because we can't see more than 2 feet in front of us, we're all gonna die. And then
yeah,
come to realize, like, no, they're not stupid enough to be out in this. We're the only ones suffering. They're all bunkered down. We're just the ones eating literal shit sandwiches.
yeah, yeah, you're absolutely right. Um, so those are the things that really, drove me. There was so many of so many unknowns, right? So many things we were completely unprepared for because they're things you can hardly think of that could happen, or happen in sequence, or happen simultaneously. Um, and I talk about it a few times, and I won't jump. I'll let you drive I'll let you drive the train.
Yeah, please.
Yeah,
Seriously.
so I just, I'll just talk about the opening night, which is really important for us because it was, it's all this detailed planning. All that for us, it's very formal, Marine Corps planning process type work. MOTS one level briefs. Our flight leads the going across the border. In my case, we're a flight of 4, going to insert first force onto Safwan Hill, and almost everything that could go wrong went wrong. I mean, the weather you couldn't see. We were called to go out early. The sun hadn't set. The moon was never going to rise because it was a moonless night. It was a 50-year sandstorm, and we were told we're going to go. So we hop in and we go. And so the details of the flight I lay out, I lay out, pretty well in the book. Um, and somehow by hook or by crook, we find our way back. We go to Safwan and we can't get first force in. It's just the helicopter crews are doing everything they can. They just can't land. They can't see. Meanwhile, my section, we're engaging targets all over the north and the east of Safwan Hill, and it's very chaotic. And I'm doing this, 50, 60, 70 knots, trying not to lose my wingman. We really just can't see much of anything. But the point is, we land and we all look at each other, and no one says a word. But we're like, we can never do this again. We can never do this again. We'll never survive another like this. We'll never survive another night. And the next night, we went out and flew 13 straight hours, and we did it, the next night, and the next night, and the next night. And you learned that, like, you'd never been here before. You'd never been in a situation like this, but you took little snippets of training. You took little things. You took a little, confident wink from your co-pilot, and you debriefed the heck out of everything. And then, you're like, okay, we don't. This isn't a really a choice. These are called, this is a flight schedule. We're gonna go out and execute this. It's signed by our skipper. So you learn real early that you were going to do things and be called on to do things that you had never done before, and there was really no book for it, and that we had training, and you certainly rely on your training. But at this point, this is why they pay you. This is why you're paid as a pilot, to make these critical decisions. And look, some of the dumbest decisions I made were, ensuring we could get out and support Marines. It's because that's why we're there. We knew we have to do that. I just want to talk about the opening night because it was very impactful for all of us. And I'm not doing it justice. All the crews that were out there, both my squadron and again East Coast squadrons, and then West Coast squadrons out of Mag 39, and then certainly some of the units off the MEU. And we lost aircraft that night. I dedicate the book to the air crews we lost in those first 25, 26 days. I think we lost a 46 on the Afwa Peninsula. So we knew it was bad, and it was probably not going to get a lot better for a while.
Yeah, that opening night portion of the book was really interesting to me because I was completely oblivious to what was going on. Obviously we went in with the ground forces, but you guys have been operating for almost, 12 hours at that point. And we had just heard that, the Safwan Hill thing didn't play out, but we didn't really know what was going on other than, all of a sudden here's a, you know, like in the movie 300, it's like they're tomahawks that are blotting out the sun, going overhead. Like,
Right.
I guess we're
Right.
going, we're in our attack, we're in the assault position. I guess where this is happening. So yeah, it was really interesting. And I think it was extremely, um, it was eye-opening, I think, for everyone, more so obviously for you guys, right? Right there at the tip of the spear. But yeah, I thought that was really cool to get your perspectives on it, and to see sort of the first stages of the invasion through your eyes. So you'd mentioned too, 2004, then 2005, in what you know seems like this. It could be something along the lines, same song, different verse. What were some of the things that changed for you, as we went from this, conventional war, mission accomplished, routing the, fourth largest military in the world to now this like deep counterinsurgency fight. What did that mean for you guys? As grunts of the air, I can imagine a lot of it was very similar, but the ROEs are very different. Can you sort of talk about the different phases of the war as you experienced them?
Yeah, so the interesting, I mean, the interesting, one of the interesting thing about 2003 was, I'm sure you felt the same way. We didn't know there was going to be an end, right? It
No,
was,
I joke all the time. Like I remember, like no shit, like quite literally high fiving people. Like we got our combat action ribbon, man. We're gonna get home. We're gonna be the big dogs. Everybody's gonna be looking up to us. I went on recruiting duty. 2.5 years later, I come back and there's Lance Corporals like 3 rows deep, and I'm sitting there with like my car and a NAM, and like, like what the fuck happened to the Marine Corps while I was gone?
yeah, they went to war and stayed at war.
Yeah, they never
Um,
came back. Yeah, it was amazing.
so that was one of the things as just far as like, for all Marines, like personal stressors, like, things that people think about and trying to compartmentalize things and try to put where you are into context. That's what made 2003 for me again so unique, is because we didn't know we were going home. We had no idea. You know, we when Nazarene happened, we turned Muse around. We started flowing more forces into theater. Um, we didn't know when it would end, and for us, by the time the book ends, where you'll see, we kind of we knew the war wasn't over. We knew our war was over for now, but we knew the war was nowhere near from over. Um, and so when I returned in 2004, things have changed dramatically. You know, we, I getting some early flights, and we were flying into Baghdad, which was like the Emerald City to me. Like you just didn't fly there. Um, and no, we are flying in, these places where you'd run and escort wounded Marines into Baghdad or up into Balad. And so it became much more, I hate to say scripted, it became much more organized. There was rules for how to get in and out of places. There was rules for how to fly. We had some more restraints, both restraints and constraints put on us, um, that were, some were healthy, some were not as healthy. But the war changed dramatically. We were focused now in the triangle, and we were focused between, really the flashpoints of Ramadi and Fallujah. And for me, I'd gone back now as a commander, as lieutenant colonel, and it was really about how do we sustain operations? How do you get 27 helicopters to fly 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and still have capacity, right? So we need to fly these minimum amount of routes, missions, whether it's route convoy, known escorts, and we do, really known missions, right? We have, Marine unit's going to go in here, they're going to kick down doors here, SEALs force, whoever it is, we're on station or just off station, ready to come in and support. So it was really it was a, it was a different kind of war for us. 2003 was a exceptional amount of freedom. You check in with an air officer, say with 5th Marines, and he would say, "Hey, can you go up the next 25 miles and help me?" And we'd say, "Of course we can." 2004, and this of course led into 2005. A little more restrictive. You can't roll in hot, with a couple of 19 shot pods of rockets into downtown Ramadi. Doesn't mean we didn't when you had to, because it was validated. But it mean it was just a different type of restrictions, which was probably healthy in a lot of ways. So the war also gave us, and for me, it gave me Al Taqaddum, right? It gave me a little home base, uh, where you knew I was going to be there, and for me, I would fly nights and have others fly days, and it gave you a sense of, you could develop a cadence, and you could, not that we necessarily did it every day, but you could tick off days, right? You knew when you were showing up, and you knew when you were going home. Hey, I'm showing up here, I'm going to rip here, and I'm going to rip within 2 weeks plus or minus. And then you go home, and you know when you go back. So that gave everyone, I think for me, it gave everyone a little more sense of normalcy, because you could plan for things a little bit better. You know, between then and 3 and 4, I had packed up my wife, I packed up my 4 kids. My youngest daughter was born a week after 9/11, right? So my kids have been living this, and so I packed them up and moved them to California, and I leave for pretty much the next 2 years. We pack up
Yeah.
and we move to Quantico. My kids are like, "Hey, Dad, yeah, California was great. Why'd we move there again?" Yeah. So no, for me, uh, flying's flying, and leading's lead, and maintaining aircraft is maintaining aircraft. But the dynamics of the missions certainly changed. Now, and we faced tragedy in 2004. We lost a great friend of mine. Was shot and killed in Fallujah, and it happens. We had another aircraft that was shot down with a surface-to-air missile. Those crews survived. So as the war seemed to simplify, the enemy seemed to get um, a little more mature in their tactics. Did we become more predictable? I don't know. We have to do certain things certain ways to safely employ ordnance. Does that make us predictable? Probably it does make us predictable in certain senses. But I think the enemy got smarter, and we began to lose more aircraft. Certainly 2004, 5, and 6, we lost a bunch that I can count on that were Marine aircraft that were shot down primarily by surface-to-air missiles. So the enemy was getting smarter. They were understanding our tactics better. We adapted, but it's we all know. Great general says, the enemy gets a vote, certainly.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, especially in that counterinsurgency fight, I mean, so much of it was just reactionary. You don't know what you don't know, so you just keep doing that thing and then be ready to change it. Um, yeah, it was it's a gnarly thing. So, sir, what about so for your book then, as we're talking about, different phases of warfare, um, close air support, flying missions, day to day, like who's your audience for this? Was this a book that you wrote? Was it sort of a way was it cathartic for you to put all this stuff into a narrative, or was there an audience that you want this stuff to reach out to?
So, I think I all no, all the above. Um, yeah. So, before I wrote it, I wrote a pretty detailed proposal, and I thought about it, and again, I talked to multiple publishers, and publishers had ideas and thoughts, but I went through and tried to answer my big questions of why, kind of the 5 Ws, and then who my audience is, and what's my secondary and kind of third audience in mind, and knowing that this is a lot of people's story, but it's only told through my lens, and I can only tell the stories that I saw or see. Uh, and so that's one of the kind of regrets I have is I really this could have turned into a 1,500-page opus. It could have gone on forever, just because there's so many important things. But I really just wanted to focus on these 26, 27 days. Um, I think every Marine, I think every military and aviation enthusiast, friends, families, uncles, brothers, sisters will love to get an idea of what their niece or nephew or son or daughter or grandson were doing. I think they'll get an appreciation of it. Does it come with an aviation flair? Of course it does, because you're for good or worse, you're in my cockpit with me. You close the door and we spend the next, you know, 6 weeks together, 24/7. But I I think as a core, I think again I talked to great friends of mine that are either still on active duty or recently left, and they said, Eric, I was there, and I just never imagined what it was like. I didn't know you. I just assumed you guys were, you come up, you'd shoot, you go back, you'd eat MREs, you'd shower. I'm like, dude, we went back 500 meters and reloaded. Like there's no
Yeah.
showers. There's no,
No,
like,
I blame Top Gun. I just blame Top Gun because I had the exact same image in my head.
you know. And so, very interestingly, I've had some friends who are carrier aviators, mostly Navy, uh, from Vietnam era guys to modern day, and they're like, Eric, I just never thought about that. Guys, we we we'd launch from the carrier, we come out, we'd have a bombing mission or a strike mission, and it was stressful. And we hit the tanker, and we go back and we land, and we go to Midrats, or we catch the chow at the carrier. You're on multiple acres of U.S. sovereign U.S. soil. And I'm not wanking about this. This is just our
Right.
reality. It's just we
Right.
would go half mile behind the enemy, and we'd refuel and rearm, and we go back and we do it again. And at the end of that day, if we could find our way back to our case, Jaliba, however they pronounce it, which is just south of Talil and Nazariyah, that was our temporary home, which was it was a sand dirt floor tent with a rack. so
Yeah.
so I think people understood that a little bit better. So I think you know hell, I think every Marine should read it. I'm being selfish, right? I think every Marine, every leader should read it. Have an appreciation of what we do, and it's not an appreciation just look at us. It's appreciation that we're all in this together. This is a team fight, and and that's it. Nothing more, nothing less. But
Yeah.
I like to, believe all the folks I talked to when I wrote this book, and they have talked to me, they appreciate it. In the last audience, I'll tell you, and I've had some pretty emotional exchanges, people emailing me or people I don't know who were either Army pilots or they were Marine H-1, pilots or Marine pilots of every flavor who were either there or in some cases missed it and felt like, this sense of guilt that like that was that's what I was built to do. I spent, 25 years in the Marine Corps. I got out in pick your net, 1998 or 2001. And I never did this. Like this is what I was built to do. I was purpose built to do this job, which you're talking about. Um, and others, Marine and Army guys who were there are like, hey, I've never read no one's ever told this story. And I can relate to you as a Marine because we did very similar things in the Army. And so, it's it's not a book of all colors, but I'd like to think it talks to a lot of things that we all value, particularly as Marines, things we all value.
Absolutely, sir. I think a lot of that um, comes through, obviously, not just on the page in your prose, but in the middle parts here, you have these pictures. And the thing that I really struck me, one was how there's no pictures of just you. Like this isn't a there I was sort of memoir, but also too all of the different like your emphasis, your focus on the unit. Um, the HMLA 267, HMM 162. There's all these images of what helos do in support of the ground combat element. I think that also struck me as it really enhances the narrative that you've established here, and that is as a Marine Corps, we really are a air ground task force, and that these two things we are inextricably linked, for better or for worse.
I agree. I agree. And, that's where we talked about having an opportunity to talk to so many friends and other folks that serve there. You feel an obligation to make sure you tell their story correctly. And you're right. This story is not about me. Again, friends of mine would just tell you have to suffer hearing it through my lens. Or sometimes, friends have told me they can actually hear my voice as they're reading the book. You know,
Audible, sir. You got an Audible contract.
we do have Audible, and Ken does a great job. We have a guy who does Audible. He's amazing. Uh, but yeah, that's another story.
Well, so this has been really great. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time. Where can our listeners find you? You have on the socials, or do you have a website? Or
I do. EricBuer.com. You can go there and you can read more and find out more. Certainly on Instagram and Facebook, and most social media platforms. Um, got multiple book signings coming up, mostly local, but I put those out there. The book's available anywhere. You go into Amazon, Barnes and Noble. It's available in every format you'd like. Certainly as a Kindle or as an Audible, or certainly as a hardcover. Um, but yeah, it's available everywhere, and I encourage you to give it an opportunity.
Yeah, I definitely second that, sir. Well, thank you again, sir, so much, and thank you for writing this book. It was very eye-opening for me, and like we've said now a few times on the show, like it was really interesting to get that perspective, from just a couple hundred feet above where we were. But yeah, thank you for your service. Thank you for writing this book, and thank you for being with us today.
Vic, my pleasure. And you're quite humble, and I appreciate everything you've done here today, and thank you to your readers as well.
All right, sir. Have a great day.
Thanks, Vic.
The Marine Corps requires leaders of all ranks to have a deep understanding of war and the employment of force. MCDP 1 reminds Marines that the military profession is a thinking profession. Every Marine is expected to be a student of the art and science of war. It goes on to say that every Marine has an individual responsibility to study the profession of arms. Self-directed study in the art and science of war is at least equal in importance to maintaining physical condition and should receive at least equal time. The Marine Corps Association understands the critical importance of ensuring that Marines are as mentally ready for combat as they are physically ready. That is why we offer an entire page dedicated to wargaming on our website. We have recommendations for both tabletop board games as well as computer games. And for Marine Corps Association members, there is a discount code for war game design studios that you can find on the website. War games are a great way to immerse yourself in history and to put yourself in the shoes of the great leaders of history. Go beyond guided instruction and experience the thrill of wargaming. Check us out at mca-marines.org/decision-making-exercises/wargaming-2. That's mca-marines.org/decision-making-exercises/wargaming-2. Take your training to the next level.
Scuttlebutt is a production of the Marine Corps Association. I am William Truding, but you've also heard the voices or contributions of Vic Rubel, USMC retired, Nancy Lichman, or Ty Frazier. The opinions expressed in this episode do not reflect the official stance of the Marine Corps, DoD, or Marine Corps Association.